Hello and welcome back to HEMA Fight Breakdowns. Today I'm going to be breaking down another fight from Sword Quench 2024, which happened a couple weeks ago. And no, I'm not doing it again just because Donnybrook hasn't uploaded any footage yet, but because it was a really great fight that took place between two of my friends, Sam and AJ, and both of whom use a very different stance than the one I've been talking about as of late. If you haven't seen it in the last couple of videos, I've been talking at length about the kind of moves and stances you have when your right leg is forward, your thumb is on the shield, and your crossguard is horizontal, and the different things you can do from that position, and the different kinds of cuts and thrusts and stuff like that. But I don't often talk about this kind of knuckle bow aligned, I guess you could call it, stance, because it doesn't happen all that much. But here we have a fight between two people who use it very prolifically and very successfully, so I figured it would be a really good idea to break down their fight so that we can see the kinds of advantages and disadvantages and the kinds of attacks that they use from this unique guard. So starting off with the first exchange, it's a bit of a long one, but it gives us a really good opportunity to talk about the specific stances and the guards here. And despite the fact that you're going to see from both fighters here that their right leg and their dominant leg is forward, you will notice that their crossguard is aligned with their knuckles, meaning that they are not doing what I do, which is keeping your point forward and your shield flat and facing up towards the ceiling with your thumb on top of it. And the reason I do that is because it allows me to threaten with the point very effectively and keep my crossguard horizontal, which protects my hands. But the reason you might want to stand in a stance like these two is because it allows you to very, very quickly do two very important things. One, as Sam just demonstrated here, is it allows you to target the hands with your edge already aligned with an extreme amount of efficiency of movement. If I was to try to throw a hand cut from my position, I would have to first turn my hand in order to align the crossguard, aka the edge, with my target, and that can be a little bit of a tell for your opponent. It can become a little bit more obvious when they're going to try to snipe your hands if every time they have to do so, they have to flip their hands 90 degrees. So this is a pretty efficient pro for this particular kind of stance, even if it does look a little, unenthusiastic. So skipping forward a couple of exchanges, the next thing I want to talk about is how this knuckle-aligned crossguard allows you to do a couple of things in the mid-range. Now, normally, from my perspective, I would have maybe missed a thrust or tried to parry from this particular position, and then would have tried to Zverk my way out of it. And you do see something similar here. AJ, fencer on the right here, gestures forward with a feint high on his right side, then transitions to a left Zverkow or middle cut, straight to Sam's head, and it ends up working out for him because he ends up in a kind of hanging position that Sam's blade bounces off of right as he gets hit in the head. And this kind of setup and payoff would work perfectly fine if you were in a flat horizontal thumb grip. However, one thing I want to point out here is that being in a hanging parry works way, way better when your crossguard and again your edge are aligned with your knuckles, because a hanging parry with the flat of the sword is significantly less protective for a number of reasons. One, when your crossguard is aligned horizontally and you're in your Zverk position, with your hand kind of sitting up here with your thumb on the bottom of the blade, what happens is that it might protect your head a little bit better because of the horizontal plane of the crossguard, but what it doesn't do is protect your hands very well. And as you see from this particular exchange, what you notice is that the reason AJ was able to get in over the guard of Sam is particularly because when AJ blocked the attack that Sam threw at his head, his edge was on and his sword did not collapse at all under the structure of Sam's cut. And that was primarily because the edge was facing outward. And this would be consistent even with period historical swords, which were at least a little bit floppy and would most certainly have slightly weaker structure on the flat as opposed to on the edge. Now, normally when you're in this kind of thumb grip, the reason you put your thumb on the bottom of the blade is to give it that little bit of extra structure. But in my opinion, even that thumb on that particular point isn't quite enough to make up for the fact that the edge provides the absolute greatest structure you can have. So if you're doing a more kind of traditional hanging parry style guard, having your guard in alignment with your knuckles, and again, thus your edge, really gives you the advantage in these kinds of situations because it allows you to start from a strong structured position from which to throw counterattacks and parries. So for this next exchange, we get a little bit of a pro and a little bit of a con for this particular kind of stance. Now, starting off in the exchange, Sam on the left throws a very hard, very structured cut towards AJ that was a bit of a feint. I say it's a feint because it doesn't look like it had the range to really reach AJ, and because there was no forward commitment, it's basically one of those things where you swing really hard at somebody's sword with the intention of having them parry it, just to see if they're going to immediately and reflexively try to counterattack you. But in this case, that didn't happen. But what did happen is that we see a good demonstration of the kinds of guards you can put up from the side of AJ when something like this is happening to you. And ironically, despite the fact that AJ learns from a Fiore, an Italian-style longsword system, he does what I would consider a almost perfect representation of a Germanic-style winding. Basically, he goes from his left plow, where his, again, crossguard is aligned with his knuckles, and goes immediately up into his right ox. And the process of shifting from that guard from one side to the other does two things simultaneously. It presents a threat because his point is now in line, and if Sam had continued forward, perhaps without any real regard for his safety, he might have stabbed himself. And two, it parries. It does a good job of blocking that opening from all things. And despite the fact that, again, you might think that a horizontal crossguard might protect your hands better, in these instances, when you're in a high guard, having a horizontal guard does the exact opposite. It leaves your hands open. It's entirely possible that if AJ had tried to do a cron parry from this situation, Sam might have been able to nick him in the hand as he rose from his bottom left quadrant to his top right, which would have been seriously problematic. But because he had his crossguard aligned up, his edge was aligned up, and it was a little bit at a 45-degree angle, which means that anything that Sam throws lands immediately into the crossguard cross-section of AJ's blade, which is a great situation to be in. Now, moving on to the rest of the exchange, we see a disadvantage of this particular thing, in that AJ throws a hand shot that looked like it was more intended to be a headshot originally, but because of the travel of the blade, slid down Sam's blade and hit him in the arm. And the reason it did this is actually, again, because his blade was oriented towards his arm line. Because when you're in a kind of right ox style position, your crossguard on one hand is pointing 45-degree angle toward the ground, and the other one is pointing 45 degrees toward the ceiling. But if it's not quite angled enough, what can happen is exactly what happens here. Attacks will slide down your sword, land directly in your crossguard, but because the gap between the angle of your crossguard and the angle of your blade is essentially pointed directly at your arm, what you end up doing accidentally is feeding attacks directly into your own body. And the reason this can happen is because of these short-edge deflection-style parries. So as you see here, Sam tried to defend his dominant line, aka his right side. And this is particularly difficult for this kind of guard to defend because it's so very easy to not turn your long edge toward the incoming strike and try to do it with the short edge, which normally isn't so much of a problem, but it requires far more range of motion in order to stay safe, because as you can see here, without that extra range of motion and clearing it off well past your right side, you can unintentionally leave openings where even stopping the blade at the level of your right sideline will still allow it to hit certain parts of your arm and shoulder. The next exchange we're going to look at goes a little bit more in depth into why defense can be so difficult from this guard. Now, in this exchange, Sam throws another kind of baited attack that I think he intended to just land onto AJ's sword and cause some kind of counterattack, but in this case, AJ completely denied him the bind, and it turned out that Sam had put a little bit too much oomph into that cut, leaving him in a vulnerable position when it completely whiffed. At which point, AJ does something very smart. He feints an attack onto his right side, showing a clear counterattack, and then instead goes onto the left. And what that means is that Sam has to try to bite on the parry on that feinted attack, and bites a little bit too hard, resulting in him being completely unable to move onto his upper right opening and defend himself from the real attack. Now, the reason this has to do with this knuckle-aligned crossguard situation is because if you watch carefully in the footage, when Sam goes to parry that attack on his left side, you see how he has to turn his long edge all the way into where he thinks the attack is coming from, and you can see how the compoundment of not only having to windshield wiper his hands across his body from the center line to his left sideline, but also rotate his hands, puts that little bit of extra oomph and that little bit of extra momentum into the parry, which can be really, really beneficial when there's something there to parry. But when it's a feint, it means that you end up putting way more emphasis and way more movement into your parry, which leaves you open on the opposite side. This is a situation where having your crossguard flat might have been a little bit easier, because instead of having to rotate his hands and shift them to the left, he could have simply pulled his hands toward his chest and created a kind of flat wall against the left side of his body. That would have been a little bit easier, not only to parry the attack that might have been coming from there, but it also would have been easier to then shift from that side to the other side without having to take up that much space and use up that much time. The fact that these parries with the edge out are so much more effective is a kind of double-edged sword, no pun intended, where every single amount of emphasis you put on your parry is theoretically movement and efficiency that you've lost if there's nothing to parry. Another thing to consider when trying to choose this guard or another guard is how does it interact with the thrust. Now, as I said previously, when your thumb is on the shield and your crossguard is horizontal, you have a pretty easy time threatening with the point and simultaneously protecting your hands. So how does that differ when your crossguard is now aligned with your knuckles? Well, we see a pretty good example here. AJ comes in with some feinted attacks. Sam tries to attack and prep in order to simply stab AJ in the face, or it looked like maybe even his hands as he was coming forward, and does so successfully. However, immediately after this happens, AJ is able to complete his attack and hit Sam in the head. And the problem here is one where what could possibly have gone differently if Sam was in a different guard when he engaged in this thrust? Now, in my opinion, regardless of whether or not his knuckles were aligned with the crossguard or the crossguard was horizontal across his hands, AJ probably still would have been able to complete this cut. However, primarily the defense that comes from thrusting and landing a thrust has to do with the wind you do after. And in my opinion, landing a thrust with your crossguard horizontal presents two distinct opportunities that you can take advantage of. Namely, that you can wind both to your right side and to your left side, which will cause your crossguard to rise in that position. So if you come in flat like this and you wind up to your right goes up on that side, and it kind of protects your head and your upper openings over there while opening them on this side, and vice versa if you go on the other side. But if you come in with your crossguard horizontal, look at how much more you have to wind in order to get to a situation where you're similar. You have to do a pretty similar wind, but with two hands on the sword, this can be a lot more complicated, meaning that, in my opinion, even when you land a thrust with your crossguard horizontal, you have a significantly harder time winding your long edge or even your short edge into your opponent's blade in order to protect yourself from that afterblow. Now, the last exchange we're going to look at is another advantage for having your crossguard aligned with your knuckles, but it's not one that people necessarily think a lot about, and it has to do with one-handed weapon fighting. Now, if you've ever done any one-handed weapon fighting, you know there pretty much is no version where you put your thumb on the shield or on the flat of the blade in order to fight. You don't do it in rapier, you don't do it in messer, you don't do it in sword and buckler. As far as I know, you don't do it ever. You certainly don't do it in dagger. So, in a lot of ways, people will naturally gravitate towards this crossguard aligned to the knuckles. In my opinion, primarily when they're newer, because it means that it allows them to transfer their guards to other one-handed weapons. But when you're a far more elite fighter, like Sam and AJ are, I think one of the other advantages that comes up is that it allows you to transition all the skills that you've learned and have mastered from other one-handed weapon fighting techniques and apply them to longsword. Now, what we see in this exchange is Sam is eyeing up the guard of AJ as he sits in a low Alber guard. And generally, when you're in that kind of low guard, what you're looking to do is bait your opponent into coming forward aggressively so that you can use a short edge deflection up and put it off to the side and then throw a follow-up cut. Throwing Alber or standing in Alber with your thumb on the shield makes absolutely zero sense because all you've done is make your cron parry that much farther away. A short edge deflection, on the other hand, can engage much more quickly because you can simply pop the middle of the sword or the weak of the sword up into the center line without necessarily having to raise your hands any higher. Doing this with the flat of the sword would be extremely ineffective, again, because the structure of the flat is so much worse at pushing people out of the way, but also because your follow-up would have to inevitably turn the crossguard in order to put the edge back online to cut somebody properly. But another thing that can happen here is that, as I mentioned earlier, these one-handed techniques are such that if you understand how much better range is with the longsword in one hand and certain ways that you can void parts of your body and do exactly what Sam does here, which is basically threaten that short edge deflection to try to get AJ to bind with him in the middle, and then immediately spring up his point and throw it forward with his dominant hand and then turn his body. What we see here is an instance where Sam is able to void the parts of himself that AJ would have to try to stab in order to double him, while simultaneously delivering a longer range stab than AJ can throw while having two hands on his sword. And while it might not seem important, it is actually very important that Sam's blade was aligned with his knuckles as he started to do this, because it not only allowed him to more efficiently angle his point upwards so that his point was on line, but also to make sure that when he did inevitably turn his torso to try to void AJ's counter thrust, that his blade was not getting bound up on AJ's with a flat-to-flat interaction. Again, when you have two crossguards that are both flat and they're both kind of running into each other, you might get this, where they're going to be at slightly different angles, and thus the crossguards are going to lock into each other. But if one of them is vertical and the other's horizontal, what might happen is that one of them might be turned ever so much too much, and then you can kind of come in vertical past each other. You'll see this happen a lot when two people who, again, are newer are both standing in vertical guards and they just keep stabbing the crap out of each other. This is because one person could turn to horizontal and maybe cover a little bit more of a line. If they were both horizontal, they cover even more line. So Sam is taking advantage simultaneously of the fact that his one-handed longsword thrust is going to be longer than AJ's, and the fact that his vertical crossguard is not going to necessarily bind up in the exact same ways as a more horizontal crossguard would. And what this means is that while two people who are in horizontal left plow might have a pretty difficult time thrusting each other, someone who can then shift to a vertical plow might actually have a better chance of getting into their target, so long as they can sufficiently protect themselves from the horizontal thrust that is inevitably coming at them. So, if you watched this and thought up until now that I was full of crap with the horizontal versus vertical crossguard, or you thought I was just a dirty sport fencer who fought with my right leg forward all the time and tried to justify it, here's a pretty good example of two very high-level tournament fighters who don't fight my way and honestly beat me probably 6 times out of 10 anyway. So feel free to rage at me in the comments or wait until next week on Tuesday when you'll get another video.